Imagine a heat so thick you can taste the iron in the air. Louisiana, 1851. The sun hangs heavy over New Orleans, but it offers no light, only a stifling, oppressive glare. On the raised wooden platforms of the auction block, lives are reduced to ledger lines and ink stains. But among the sea of faces, one woman stood with a gaze that didn't flicker. They thought they were buying a body. They didn't realize they were inviting a reckoning. History remembers the numbers, the prices, and the names of the masters. But today, we pull back the moss-covered curtain on the 1851 auction scandal, a tale of hidden bloodlines, a rare forgotten account, and a woman whose presence turned a routine sale into a moment of pure, chilling defiance. This isn't just history. It's a ghost story that's still breathing. The rare document at the heart of the 1851 Louisiana auction was far more than a simple bill of sale or a dusty record of transaction. It was a meticulously preserved 1851 ledger that acted as a silent, lethal witness to the darkest corners of the New Orleans aristocracy. Unlike the standardized shipping manifests of the era, this specific account was written in a frantic, elegant hand that detailed the forbidden lineage of the woman on the block. It contained dates, locations, and names that linked the captive directly to the very men who sat in the front row of the gallery. The ink was faded, yet the words possessed a terrifying clarity that stripped away the carefully constructed masks of the elite. This was not just paper. It was a physical manifestation of a truth that the South had tried to bury in its swamps. As the auctioneer began his rhythmic chant, the sudden appearance of this ledger sent a visible shudder through the crowded room of wealthy patrons. The document didn't just list a price. It chronicled a history of betrayal that stretched back through 3 generations of a prominent family. It proved that the woman standing before them carried the same blood as the judge who presided over the city's highest courts. Every line of the account served as a map of secrets, tracing the movement of bodies and the transfer of wealth through illicit unions. The atmosphere in the hall shifted from one of commerce to one of a looming, inevitable legal catastrophe for everyone. Men who had come to buy property suddenly realized they were looking at a living mirror of their own darkest, hidden sins. What made the 1851 account so rare was the level of forensic detail it provided about the intersection of law and human cruelty. It listed specific items of jewelry and land deeds that had been promised to the woman's ancestors in exchange for their silence. These were not the ramblings of a victim, but a structured, legalistic record designed to hold the powerful accountable in a court of law. The document acted as a bridge between the world of the enslaved and the world of the free, shattering the illusion of separation. It was a weapon of words, sharpened over decades and hidden until the exact moment it could do the most damage. The crowd watched in horror as the ledger was passed from hand to hand, its edges frayed but its power undeniable. The ledger also contained specific notes on the physical characteristics that linked the woman to her captors, providing undeniable proof of her parentage. Such accounts were almost never allowed to survive, as they functioned as a direct threat to the inheritance laws of the time. If the information in the document was validated, it would mean that the woman on the block had a legal claim to the estate. This would mean that the auction itself was a crime, a kidnapping of a rightful heir under the guise of trade. The tension grew so thick that the auctioneer's voice cracked, his gavel hovering in the air as if frozen by the document's weight. The silence that followed was the sound of an entire social system realizing it was built upon a foundation of lies. For the woman on the stand, the document was her only shield against a fate of total erasure and the crushing weight of the plantation. She held the knowledge of its contents like a burning coal, watching as the men in the gallery realized their reputations were dissolving. The 1851 account revealed that the woman's grandmother had been a free woman of color whose papers were stolen during a raid. This proved that her entire line had been held in bondage illegally, making every year of their labor a debt that could never be paid. The document was a ticking clock, counting down to a moment of total social and financial ruin for the city's elite. It was the only piece of evidence that could turn a slave auction into a scene of revolutionary justice and fear. Ultimately, the survival of this rare 1851 account remains one of the great mysteries and triumphs of the pre-Civil War era in the South. It was a miracle that such a damning piece of evidence hadn't been burned or lost in the humid, rot-filled air of the bayou. Its existence forced the hand of the law, creating a scandal that reverberated through the newspapers of the North and the parlors of the South. The document became a symbol of the revenge of history, a way for the voiceless to finally speak through the medium of the law. It reminded the world that while a person could be sold, their history and their truth remained theirs alone to wield. Today, that ledger stands as a haunting reminder of the power of a single record to bring a corrupt empire to its knees. The revelation of the 1851 account acted like a seismic tremor beneath the gilded foundations of Louisiana's most prestigious and powerful families. As the details of the woman's lineage were whispered through the auction crowd, the air of aristocratic superiority began to evaporate. These families had built their reputations on the myth of pure bloodlines and a rigid, unshakable social hierarchy that justified their rule. Now, that myth was being dismantled in real time by a single piece of paper that proved their shared ancestry with the enslaved. The shock was not merely moral, it was a direct threat to the social fabric that kept the elite in power. In an instant, the pride of the New Orleans high society was replaced by a cold, calculating fear of exposure. The auction block had unexpectedly become a stage for the total collapse of their carefully curated public identities. Financial ruin loomed over the horizon as the legal implications of the document began to settle into the minds of the bidders. If the woman was indeed the rightful heir to a portion of these great estates, the entire wealth of the family was in jeopardy. Under the complex laws of the time, a proven blood connection could lead to massive lawsuits and the redistribution of ancestral lands. Creditors who had previously seen these families as safe bets began to reconsider their positions as the scandal deepened. The potential for a total economic wipeout was real, as the document threatened to invalidate decades of property transfers. This was not just a blow to their pride, it was a dagger aimed at the very heart of their bank accounts. The wealth built on the backs of others was suddenly being reclaimed by the truth of its own origin. As the news of the scandal rippled outward from the auction house, the internal structures of these prominent households began to crumble from within. Wives of the elite, long forced to ignore the open secrets of their husbands, found themselves unable to maintain the charade any longer. The document provided names and dates that turned vague suspicions into concrete, undeniable evidence of systemic betrayal and hidden family branches. Dining rooms that were once filled with laughter and political planning became silent battlegrounds of resentment and deep-seated bitterness. The social glue that held the ruling class together, the shared silence and the mutual protection, was dissolving with every new detail revealed. Neighbors who had once stood in solidarity began to distance themselves to protect their own reputations from the spreading stain. The elite were no longer a unified front. They were individuals scrambling to survive a catastrophic social wreckage. The political power of these families, which relied heavily on their perceived moral and social standing, began to wither in the public eye. Rival political factions saw an opportunity to strike, using the 1851 account as a weapon to dismantle the influence of their opponents. The scandal provided the perfect ammunition for those looking to challenge the status quo and the entrenched power of the planter class. Every speech made in the local legislature was now shadowed by the lingering questions regarding the legitimacy of the leaders. The authority that had once seemed absolute was now being openly mocked in the taverns and the backstreets of New Orleans. Power that had been passed down through generations was suddenly standing on a foundation of quicksand that threatened to swallow it whole. The collapse of their social standing was a precursor to a much larger and more permanent loss of control. Fear turned into a desperate, frantic energy as the families attempted to scrub their names from the public record and the account. They realized that once the story reached the national press, there would be no way to contain the fallout or the shame. Lawyers were summoned in the middle of the night to draft counterstatements and to find loopholes that might suppress the document. However, the more they struggled to bury the truth, the more oxygen they seemed to give to the growing fire. The scandal had moved beyond the auction house and had become a part of the city's collective consciousness, impossible to erase. Their attempts at damage control were seen as admissions of guilt, further accelerating their descent from the heights of social grace. The very systems they had designed to keep others down were now being used to record their own inevitable downfall. By the time the sun set on the day of the auction, the world as these families knew it had been forever altered. The 1851 scandal remained a permanent mark on their histories, a ghost that would haunt their descendants for over a century. It served as a grim reminder that no amount of wealth or political influence could fully hide the truth of human connection. The social collapse was a slow-motion disaster that stripped away the grandeur and revealed the rot beneath the surface of the South. The woman on the block had not just stunningly survived. She had effectively dismantled the empires of those who sought to own her. Her victory was written in the ruins of their reputations and the shattered remains of their once invincible social standing. The echoes of that day would continue to resonate, proving that justice, though delayed, could be devastatingly thorough. The woman standing upon the auction block did not mirror the expected image of a broken captive. Instead, she embodied a chilling, calculated defiance. While the men in the gallery viewed her as a commodity to be appraised, she viewed them as defendants in a trial they didn't yet realize had begun. Her silence was not a sign of submission but a tactical vacuum that forced the room to confront its own rising anxiety. She held herself with a regal, terrifying stillness that seemed to draw all the light in the sweltering room toward her own composed face. Every time a bidder looked into her eyes, they found not fear, but a cold, analytical judgment that made their hands tremble. She was using her very presence to seize control of the narrative, turning the site of her intended humiliation into her fortress. This was a psychological warfare waged with nothing more than a steady gaze and an unbreakable spirit of resistance. Her defiance was strategically anchored in her deep understanding of the very legal systems designed to keep her in perpetual, soul-crushing bondage. She had spent years memorizing the intricate nuances of Louisiana's partus sequitur vent rem laws and the specific rights afforded to those of disputed status. When the auctioneer attempted to start the bidding, she did not scream or plead, but instead motioned for her legal counsel to present the papers. She understood that in a society obsessed with the letter of the law could be turned into a trap for the powerful. By demanding a formal review of her status before the sale could proceed, she effectively froze the commerce of the entire afternoon. She was a master of the pause, knowing that every second of delay cost the auction house money and cost the elite their dignity. Her knowledge was her weapon, and she wielded it with the precision of a surgeon performing a necessary, painful operation. As the legal documents were read aloud, she stood as a living statue of justice, watching the men who claimed ownership over her begin to crumble. She had orchestrated this moment with the help of a secret network of allies who had spent months gathering the necessary evidence. Every word of the 1851 account was a stone she had helped place in the wall that was now closing in on her enemies. She did not lower her head when the most scandalous details of her lineage were shouted across the crowded, humid room for all to hear. Instead, she tilted her chin upward, forcing the men in the front row to acknowledge the biological truth they had long tried to erase. Her defiance was a public reclamation of her own identity, a refusal to let her history be written by those who sold her. She was teaching the crowd that while they might purchase her time, they would never truly possess the essence of her being. The psychological impact of her resistance was so profound that it began to infect the other enslaved individuals waiting in the wings of the market. They saw in her a blueprint for a new kind of rebellion, one that used the master's own tools to dismantle the master's own house. The whispers that traveled through the back rows were not of pity, but of a growing electric realization that power was shifting. She had broken the spell of the auction block, proving that the victim could become the victor through intellect and unyielding courage. The atmosphere of the market changed from one of grim despair to one of a tense, revolutionary expectation that hung heavy in the air. Her defiance was a spark in a dry forest, and the elite could feel the heat of the fire beginning to lick at their heels. She had turned a moment of absolute vulnerability into a display of absolute, unshakable strength that no one could ignore. She also utilized the presence of the press and foreign observers to ensure that her defiance would have a life far beyond the city limits. She knew that by making a scene that was legally grounded, she was creating a story that no newspaper could afford to ignore. Her performance was aimed at the history books, a calculated move to ensure that the 1851 auction would be remembered as a failure. Even as the authorities tried to usher her away, she spoke clearly and loudly about the rights of the freeborn and the illegally enslaved. Her voice carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floorboards and into the very souls of those who heard her. She was not just fighting for her own life, but for the legacy of every person who had been erased by the system. Every word she uttered was a nail in the coffin of the institution that sought to keep her in the shadows. By the time the proceedings were forced to a halt, she had achieved what no slave revolt of the time had quite managed to do. She had humiliated the ruling class in their own temple of commerce, using their own sacred laws to reveal their hypocrisy and greed. Her defiance was a masterpiece of timing, intellect, and raw human will that left the city of New Orleans in a state of shock. The scandal of 1851 was not just about a document. It was about the woman who had the bravery to bring it to light. She walked off that stage not as a piece of property, but as a legend whose name would be whispered in secret for generations. Her story remains a testament to the power of the individual to stand against a corrupt empire and emerge with their dignity intact. She had won the battle of the auction block, and in doing so, she had won her place in history. The moment the gravity of the 1851 account became clear, the machinery of the Louisiana elite shifted from shock to a desperate, coordinated cover-up. Local magistrates and wealthy landowners realized that if the details of this auction scandal reached the abolitionist North, it would become a devastating propaganda weapon against their way of life. Orders were whispered in the backrooms of the auction house to seize all handwritten records and to intimidate any witnesses who had seen the document. The city's newspapers, largely funded by the same families implicated in the scandal, were strictly forbidden from printing even a single line about the day's events. It was a frantic race against time to ensure that the truth of 1851 remained trapped within the humid borders of New Orleans. They treated the information like a contagion, attempting to quarantine the facts before they could infect the national political discourse. This was the birth of a conspiracy of silence, designed to protect the fragile reputation of a dying aristocracy. Police and private agents were dispatched to the offices of local printers to ensure that no rogue pamphlets or broadsides could be distributed to the public. They understood that a single printed page could travel faster than any horse, carrying the seeds of insurrection and international embarrassment across the ocean. The woman's legal counsel found themselves suddenly under investigation for unrelated, fabricated charges, their offices ransacked in search of any remaining copies of the rare account. It was a systematic dismantling of the truth, where the law was used to obstruct the very justice it was sworn to uphold. Every person who had touched the document was watched, and the atmosphere in the city turned thick with suspicion and the threat of violence. The elite were willing to burn the entire city's records if it meant erasing the specific evidence of their own blood-stained lineage. This was not just a legal defense, it was an all-out war on the historical memory of the South. Despite the heavy-handed censorship in New Orleans, the authorities feared the underground telegraph that carried news through the enslaved community and sympathetic white travelers. To counter this, they planted false stories in the regional press, claiming the auction had been a standard transaction and the woman was simply mentally unwell. They fabricated alternative histories and backdated ledgers to create a confusing cloud of misinformation that would make the truth seem like a wild, impossible conspiracy. By flooding the public consciousness with lies, they hoped to make the authentic 1851 account appear as nothing more than a desperate forgery by an embittered captive. The goal was to make the truth so difficult to find that even those who wanted to believe it would eventually give up in frustration. They were masters of the narrative, using the power of the press to rewrite the events of the afternoon before the ink was even dry. The cover-up extended into the telegraph offices, where messages heading toward New York and Boston were intercepted and carefully edited by pro-slavery agents. They knew that the Louisiana Auction Scandal would be front-page news for the anti-slavery movement, fueling the fires of a conflict that was already beginning to smolder. Any mention of rare accounts or bloodline revelations was scrubbed from the wires, replaced with mundane reports of cotton prices and local weather patterns. It was a digital age blockade in a mid-19th century world, a high-stakes effort to keep the North in total ignorance of the legal uprising. The families involved paid enormous sums of money to ensure that the silence extended all the way to the Capitol in Washington, D.C. They were buying the future by suppressing the past, hoping that the world would forget the woman who had stunned the auction block. Even the physical evidence of the woman's identity was targeted, as church baptismal records and local census files mysteriously began to vanish from their shelves. The cover-up was so thorough that it required the cooperation of clerks, priests, and city officials, all of whom had a stake in maintaining the status quo. They were erasing a human being from the fabric of society, stitch by stitch, until it was as if she had never existed at all. The 1851 account was described in official reports as a misunderstanding of clerical error, a phrasing designed to bore the public into looking the other way. However, the more they tried to hide the woman and her story, the more she became a ghost that haunted their every public gathering. The silence they created was not empty. It was filled with the heavy, pulsing weight of the truth they were so desperately trying to ignore. Ultimately, the cover-up of the 1851 Louisiana Auction Scandal remains one of the most successful, yet hauntingly incomplete, acts of censorship in American history. While they managed to keep the story out of the major headlines for a time, they could not stop the story from being whispered in the quarters. The rare document had been seen by too many eyes, and its contents had been seared into the memories of those who understood its true power. Years later, when the Civil War finally tore the South asunder, many of these suppressed accounts finally began to emerge from their hiding places in the floorboards. The cover-up had only delayed the reckoning. It had not prevented it, proving that truth is a patient and persistent force that cannot be buried forever. The woman's defiance survived the silence, becoming a part of the hidden history that eventually helped topple the very system that tried to erase her. Gemini said, "The legacy of the 1851 auction did not fade with the sunset, but instead became a haunting presence that lingered over Louisiana like a persistent, heavy fog. The ghost of the gavel refers to the psychological and social aftermath that transformed a single day of commerce into a permanent stain on the region's history. Long after the woman left the platform, the echoes of her defiance continued to vibrate through the halls of New Orleans, serving as a grim omen of a collapsing era. Every subsequent auction held in that city was compared to the scandal of 1851, with buyers and sellers alike looking over their shoulders in fear of another revelation. The event had shattered the illusion of the perfectly ordered society, proving that the truth could never be fully commodified or controlled. It was a crack in the foundation that would eventually lead to the total disintegration of the institution of slavery. The memory of that day became a silent, revolutionary force that lived in the hearts of the oppressed and the nightmares of the powerful. As the decade progressed toward the eruption of the Civil War, the scandal of 1851 was often cited in secret abolitionist circles as a primary example of Southern moral rot. The story of the woman and her rare account traveled through the grapevine, eventually reaching the ears of politicians in the North who used it to argue against the expansion of slavery. It became a piece of the larger puzzle that convinced the nation that the system was not only cruel but fundamentally chaotic and legally fraudulent. The ghost of the gavel acted as a catalyst for a changing tide in American public opinion, turning a local scandal into a national symbol of the need for systemic change. Even as the South tried to project an image of stability and strength, the 1851 incident remained a visible scar that they could not hide. It proved that the legal tools of the South were insufficient to protect its own elite when faced with the undeniable power of truth. When the Union Army finally marched into New Orleans in 1862, many of the same families implicated in the 1851 scandal found themselves facing a different kind of justice. The ghost of the gavel returned in the form of military tribunals and the sudden, violent seizure of the properties they had fought so hard to protect. The very records they had tried to burn or bury were sometimes unearthed by soldiers and freedmen, bringing the old secrets back into the harsh light of day. The woman's defiance was no longer a solitary act of resistance. It was now the spirit of an entire advancing army. The aristocratic houses that had once looked down upon the auction block were now being repurposed as headquarters for the very forces of liberation they had feared. The debt that had begun in 1851 was finally being collected in full, with interest paid in the currency of a lost war and a destroyed social order. It was a poetic and devastating conclusion to a decade of lies and cover-ups. The long-term impact on the legal landscape of Louisiana was equally profound, as the scandal forced a re-examination of the state's complex inheritance and property laws. In the post-war era, the 1851 account was often referenced in courtrooms to challenge the legitimacy of land titles and family fortunes built on the illegal enslavement of free-born individuals. The ghost of that single auction continued to haunt the land records of New Orleans for generations, complicating the lives of those who inherited the spoils of the old system. It served as a reminder that wealth gained through the erasure of human rights carries a permanent legal and moral liability. The case became a foundational study for later civil rights attorneys who looked for ways to use the master's laws to protect the descendants of the enslaved. The woman's intellectual bravery in 1851 had provided a roadmap for justice that survived the era of the gavel and into the era of the Constitution. Beyond the legalities, the ghost of the gavel lived on in the oral traditions and folklore of the Louisiana Bayou, where the woman was remembered as a folk hero of supernatural intellect. Her story was told as a cautionary tale to children, teaching them that no matter how dark the night, the light of a single true document could burn through the shadows. She was seen as a guardian of history, a figure who had stood at the crossroads of time and refused to be moved by the forces of greed. The scandal became a part of the cultural fabric of the South, a narrative of revenge that didn't require a sword, only a pen and a steady voice. It reminded the survivors of the era that the greatest weapon against tyranny is the preservation of one's own identity and the courage to speak it. The ghost was not one of terror, but one of persistent, uncomfortable truth that refused to be silenced by any amount of money or power. Today, the 1851 Louisiana Auction Scandal stands as a pivotal moment where the power of the individual intersected with the slow, grinding wheels of historical justice. We look back at the woman on the block not as a victim of her circumstances, but as the architect of her own liberation and the destroyer of an empire. Her story reminds us that even in the most oppressive systems, there are moments where the truth can stun an entire nation into silence. The ghost of the gavel remains a vital part of our collective understanding of the 19th century, a reminder that every auction was a crime and every captive a witness. The rare account she presented was more than just paper. It was the first page of a new chapter in the American story, one written in the ink of defiance and the blood of a hard-won freedom. Her legacy is the proof that while history can be hidden, it can never be completely erased as long as someone is brave enough to remember.